America built the most powerful water infrastructure on Earth. Dams, reservoirs, flood systems that redirected entire rivers. And it worked. Cities got power, and millions got clean water. But here's what nobody mentions at the dedication ceremony. Before the water came, somebody was already living there. Towns, schools, churches, cemeteries where grandparents were buried, farms that families had worked for 5 generations. The government didn't just build dams, it decided some towns were worth less than the water they were sitting on. What the textbook skipped is what that decision actually cost and who paid it. But today we're going underwater. 10 American towns that got swallowed and never came back up. Subscribe because the most important American history isn't always in a museum. A lot of it is 60 feet below a reservoir that millions of people drink from every morning without knowing what's underneath. Let's go. Number 10. Cannonsville. There's a reservoir in the Catskill Mountains with a town's name on it. And that name is the only honest thing left about what happened here. Cannonsville, Delaware County, New York. Founded in the early 1800s. Farms, families, a church, a post office. A place where people had lived long enough that their great-grandparents were buried in the local cemetery. Then New York City ran the numbers. It needed more water. The Delaware River watershed had the right geology, and Cannonsville was sitting directly in the way. The city condemned the land in the 1950s. Over 1,000 residents were forced to relocate, not asked, not negotiated with as equals, given offers by a government with the legal power to take what it needed. The houses were demolished, the cemeteries were exhumed and moved, the church came down, the store came down, everything that made Cannonsville a place where people lived, erased. The reservoir started filling in 1964. By the time the water finished rising, the town was 60 feet under. What the textbook skipped is this. New York City built 4 reservoirs in the Catskills between 1905 and 1964. Each one required a town to disappear. Cannonsville was the last. By that point, the process of erasing towns had become almost bureaucratic, efficient, clean, as if the people who lived there were a line item on a project plan. Today, the Cannonsville Reservoir supplies roughly 10% of New York City's daily water. 8 million people drink from it. Not one of them sees Cannonsville when they turn on the tap. One displaced resident reportedly said, "They moved our debt out before they moved us." At least they got that part right. Number 9. Peacher. Most towns on this list were swallowed by water from above. Peacher, Oklahoma was swallowed from below, by the very thing it spent decades pulling out of the ground. Population at peak? Nearly 20,000 people. Built practically overnight on the richest lead and zinc mining field in American history. Peacher was founded in 1913. By the 1920s, it was producing at a scale that's hard to comprehend. Over 200 mills, 10 million pounds of ore a day. More than half the lead and zinc used in World War I bullets came from Peacher alone. Then the mines played out. They closed in 1967. The pumps that kept the shafts dry shut off. The shafts filled with water, not clean water. Water saturated with lead, zinc, cadmium, arsenic, iron, and manganese. That water started seeping. Tar Creek turned red, literally red, running through the middle of town, visibly contaminated, for years before anyone in authority admitted what was happening. By the mid-1990s, the Indian Health Service tested the children. 35% had toxic levels of lead in their blood. What the textbook skipped is that none of this was a surprise. The creek was red. The toxic waste piles were everywhere. Children played on them. The dust blew through neighborhoods. People got sick. And the response was denial, delay, minimization. By 2009, the EPA bought out the last residents. Town officially deincorporated. Population, 0. The last pharmacist standing, Gary Linderman, died in 2015. There was no one left to fill a prescription for. One resident said on the way out, "We kept being told it would get fixed. They just eventually decided it was easier to erase us." Number 8. Elbowwoods. There are towns on this list where the flooding was painful but framed as progress. And then there's Elbowwoods, where it was something closer to a continuation of a pattern that had been happening to the same people for over a century. Elbowwoods was the agency seat of the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation, home of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation, a real, functioning community. schools, churches, a hospital. The most fertile agricultural land on the reservation, bottomland along the Missouri River that the tribes had farmed for generations. In the 1940s, the federal government decided to build the Garrison Dam. The three affiliated tribes opposed it fiercely. They understood immediately what a reservoir would mean. They testified before Congress. They argued the government was violating the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. They were told the dam was necessary. Progress required sacrifice. The dam was completed in 1953. Lake Sakakawea rose, Elba Woods was evacuated. By 1954, the Elba Woods High School, which had graduated its last class just 1 year earlier, was 50 feet underwater. The flooding took 156,000 acres of reservation land, a quarter of what remained, specifically the best quarter, the fertile bottomland, the timber, the sacred sites, the graves. What the textbook skipped. 7 members of the Elba Woods basketball team had served in World War II. They fought for the United States. They came home. Within a few years, the government they served flooded their town. Tribal elder Marilyn Hudson said, "It was like a second death. We lost everything that gave us life." The lake named after Sakakawea covers the community those native soldiers came home to. That irony was noted. It wasn't mentioned at the dedication. Number 7. Kinzua. In 1794, George Washington signed a treaty with the Seneca Nation. It guaranteed their land in perpetuity. In 1964, the Army Corps of Engineers flooded it. The Kinzua Dam on the Allegheny River in Pennsylvania has created a reservoir that today serves flood control, water supply, and recreation across the region. But to build it, the government had to break the Pickering Treaty, one of the oldest treaty commitments in American history. The Seneca fought for years. In 1956, a Seneca leader named Cornelius Seneca traveled to Washington to appeal to President Eisenhower. Eisenhower reportedly expressed sympathy. The dam was built anyway. Over 600 Seneca people were relocated. The flooding destroyed roughly 10,000 acres of tribal land, including the community of Kinzua, which had been a center of Seneca life along the river for generations. Homes, farms, community buildings, sacred sites underwater, cemeteries relocated. Ancestors moved so a reservoir could exist. What the textbook skipped is what that treaty meant. The Pickering Treaty of 1794 wasn't a minor agreement. It was the United States government's explicit, formal promise, after a period of devastating conflict, that the Seneca would never be displaced again. It lasted 170 years. Then the Army Corps needed a dam site. Cornelius Seneca said before the flooding, "When we signed that treaty in 1794, we thought we were signing a permanent guarantee. We were wrong. The reservoir is still there. The treaty violation has never been fully resolved." Number 6. Enfield. On the night of April 27, 1938, in a town that would cease to legally exist at midnight, the fire department threw a party. They called it the Farewell Ball. Town hall decorated, bands playing, dancing, theater, and, in a gesture of either grief or pure defiance, free beer. At midnight, Enfield was officially dissolved by the Massachusetts legislature. So were its neighbors, Dana, Greenwich, and Prescott. 4 towns gone simultaneously. The first time the legislature had ever disincorporated an entire town, times 4. The reason? Boston needed water. The Swift River Valley in central Massachusetts had the right geography. It had one problem. Roughly 2,500 people lived there, in communities settled since the early 1700s. Families who had survived the Revolution, the Civil War, 2 World Wars, and the Great Depression. They did not survive Boston's thirst. The process took over a decade. Land condemned, houses demolished, churches torn down, cemeteries relocated. Even the barnyard manure was reportedly dug up to protect the quality of what would become one of the finest municipal water supplies in America. The Quabbin Reservoir reached full capacity in 1946. Today, it holds 412 billion gallons and supplies water to over 3 million people in Boston and surrounding communities. What the textbook skipped is what happened when the clock hit midnight at the Farewell Ball. The music stopped. People stood in the hall of a town that no longer legally existed. One descendant wrote decades later, "My grandmother danced at the Farewell Ball. She never talked about it, but she kept the program her whole life, folded in the back of her Bible. Enfield is still down there. The program still exists." Number 5. A bonus entry, because Enfield doesn't exist alone. Dana, Enfield, Greenwich, Prescott. 4 towns dissolved at the same midnight. 4 communities that had existed for over 2 centuries, gone on the same clock. The scale of what happened in the Swift River Valley only lands when you look at all 4 together. 2,500 people removed, hundreds of structures demolished, dozens of cemeteries uprooted, 200 years of continuous human settlement, unmade. The buildings in all 4 towns were destroyed, but the cellars were left intact. The old roads that once led into the towns can still be followed, right to the edge of the water. Portions of Dana are on slightly higher ground. During certain conditions, the remains of some structures and the Old Town Common can be seen above the waterline. The textbooks call that partially visible remains. The people who lived there called it home. What the textbook skipped is the category of loss that doesn't fit in an engineering report. The community that dissolves when the neighbors scatter. The shared memory that doesn't move to higher ground. The 4-generation relationships that don't reassemble somewhere else into the same thing. One descendant of a Greenwich family said it plainly. "My grandmother said the water Boston drinks tastes like everything that got taken." 3 million people drink from the Quabbin every day. 4 towns are waiting underneath it in the dark. Number 4, Never Sink. The name alone should have been a warning. Never Sink, derived from a native word meaning continuously flowing, and was a community in the Catskill Mountains of New York. Real town, real people, about 340 of them, living in 6,149 acres of condemned valley. New York City needed another reservoir. The Never Sink Reservoir was the answer. In 1942, the residents were evicted. Some buildings were relocated to nearby towns. Most were bulldozed and burned in what the project managers called a final harvest. Trees removed, cellars filled in, privies disinfected. The process was the same as the other Catskill Reservoir projects. By now, a refined system for making towns disappear cleanly. The Never Sink Reservoir began flooding the land on June 4, 1953, and took 2 years to fill completely. What the textbook skipped is that Never Sink was the 4th in a series of Catskill towns consumed specifically to feed New York City. Ashokan, Gilboa, Cannonsville, Never Sink, each one a community, each one erased, each one now a part of the water system that 8 million New Yorkers use without a second thought. The irony of the name was not lost on the people who left. One evicted resident reportedly said, "They named the reservoir after us. Like that was supposed to be the tribute." A town called Never Sink. Sunk? New York City has that kind of sense of humor, apparently. Number 3, St. Thomas. This one has a twist no other town on this list can match. Because St. Thomas didn't just go underwater, it came back. Founded in 1865 by Mormon settlers who thought they were building in Utah. A survey later revealed they were actually in Nevada. The state then levied back taxes. The settlers couldn't pay. In protest, they burned their homes and walked away. Someone else moved in and rebuilt. By the early 1900s, St. Thomas had a population of around 500. A schoolhouse, a church, a post office, grocery stores, and, critically, an ice cream parlor. Then President Coolidge signed the Boulder Canyon Project Act in 1928. Hoover Dam, Lake Mead, largest reservoir in the United States. St. Thomas was in the way. The water rose slowly through the 1930s. Residents held out as long as they could. In June 1938, the final remaining resident set fire to his home, got in a boat, and rowed away. By the end of that year, St. Thomas was 60 feet underwater. It stayed there for decades, invisible, a story only the oldest locals remembered. Then the drought came. Lake Mead began dropping. Las Vegas draws 90% of its water from it. And in 2002, the ruins of St. Thomas emerged from the mud for the first time in over 60 years. Roads, foundation outlines, concrete cisterns, the remnants of the ice cream parlor, all of it still there, preserved under the water, waiting. What the textbook skipped is the strange reversal happening right now. The drought devastating the American Southwest, one of the defining crises of this century, is also the thing bringing St. Thomas back. You can walk it today. It's open to visitors. One park ranger said, "St. Thomas is the only town I know of that's both a ghost town and a climate change exhibit. Same ruins, 2 different stories. The Ice Cream Parlor Foundation is still there, never going to serve anything again. But it's there." Number 2, Celilo. Every town on this list lost something irreplaceable. Celilo lost something that had existed longer than any other settlement on this continent, and the loss happened in a single afternoon. Celilo Falls on the Columbia River in Oregon was not just a place. Archaeological evidence suggests continuous human presence going back at least 15,000 years, possibly longer. For millennia, it was a gathering point for native peoples across the entire Pacific Northwest. The Wayam people fished there. The Yakama, the Umatilla, the Warm Springs, the Nez Perce. All of them came for the salmon runs that Celilo Falls concentrated into one of the most productive fishing sites on Earth. The falls were not a backdrop. They were the reason for everything. You could hear the roar 10 miles away. Wooden platforms extended over the rushing water. Fishermen stood on them with long-handled dip nets, pulling salmon from the Columbia in numbers that had sustained communities for thousands of years. Celilo Village sat at the edge of those falls. People had been living there, continuously, in an unbroken chain, for longer than Egypt had pyramids. On March 10, 1957, the Army Corps of Engineers finished closing the gates of the Dalles Dam. The water began to rise. Within hours, some accounts say 6 hours, Celilo Falls was gone. The roar that had been constant for 15,000 years went silent on a Tuesday afternoon. The fishing platforms disappeared. The falls, which had shaped the entire cultural and economic life of the region for thousands of generations, ceased to exist. What the textbooks skipped is the specific cruelty of the speed. The people of Celilo had fought the dam. They had testified. They had been promised mitigation that was inadequate from the start. And then, in the span of an afternoon, it was gone. Tribal members who were there describe watching the falls disappear in real time. One YM elder said afterward, "The river didn't just lose its voice. We lost ours too." Celilo Falls has not made a sound in nearly 70 years. 15,000 years of continuous human habitation. Silenced in an afternoon. Number 1. Four Bears Village. We've talked about Elbowoods, the headquarters of the Fort Berthold Reservation that went underwater with the Garrison Dam, but the full story isn't one town. It's everything. The Garrison Dam didn't just flood Elbowoods, it flooded Sanish, Lucky Mound, Shell Creek, Nishu. It displaced 325 families. It took 156,000 acres. It destroyed 90% of the tribe's commercial timber. It wiped out their hospital, their schools, their roads, their farming land, their entire economic foundation. Picked up and moved to higher ground, the 3 affiliated tribes were resettled in Newtown, North Dakota, a name that says everything about what it replaced. What the textbook skipped is the word used most often by tribal members to describe what happened. Not flooded, not displaced, not relocated, terminated. The flooding of the Fort Berthold Reservation is considered by historians one of the worst acts of federal displacement of native peoples in the post-war era. It happened in peacetime, with paperwork, legally. Tribal Chairman George Gillette wept publicly when he signed the takeover agreement in 1950. He said, "The members of the 3 affiliated tribes feel that they are signing away their life." He was right. That's number 1, because no other entry on this list involved the deliberate erasure of an entire nation's way of life, carried out not in war, but in the name of progress. So here's what you have at the end of this list. 10 towns, 10 different reasons the water came. In almost every case, the people who lost their homes were the ones with the least power to stop it. Small rural communities, native nations with treaty rights that got set aside, families given offers they couldn't refuse. The official records counted structures, relocations, reservoir capacity. They didn't count the community that dissolved when the neighbors scattered. They didn't count the 15,000 years of human presence at Celilo. They didn't count what it actually costs to erase a place where people have lived their whole lives. The water is still there. The towns are still under it. Now, you know, like this video, if any part of this stayed with you, subscribe. Because Forgotten America isn't just the towns that got left behind. It's also the ones that got buried. We're going to find all of them.